She called me the ugly daughter at birthday parties, at school pickups, at the dinner table like she was simply stating the weather. And I carried that label in my body for 33 years like it was the truest thing anyone had ever told me. Then my mother leaned over to me at my grandmother's funeral and said, "Whatever mama left you came from pity, not love." And 2 hours later, my aunt, who my mother hadn't spoken to in 11 years, walked through that door with a photograph that exposed a secret so deep, so buried, so carefully hidden, that it finally explained why my mother had been punishing me my entire life for something I never even did. The first time I remember my mother using the word ugly about me, I was 7 years old, and we were standing in the checkout line at a grocery store in Beaverton. A woman ahead of us turned around and smiled at me and said, "What a sweet little girl." My mother smiled back, that perfect Diane smile, and said, "Oh, she's the plain one, Brit's the pretty one." Just like that, like she was reading ingredients off a cereal box. The woman looked uncomfortable and turned away. I stood there holding a pack of gum I'd asked for, and I put it back on the shelf. I don't know why, I just felt like I didn't deserve it anymore. Diane was the kind of woman who treated beauty like a currency, the only currency that actually mattered. She wasn't loud about it. She wasn't a screamer or a plate thrower. She was worse than that. She was precise. She knew exactly which words to use and exactly how softly to say them so they'd sink in without witnesses. My sister Brit was her masterpiece. Long, dark hair, easy laugh, the kind of girl who filled a room without trying. And I was the rough draft that never got thrown away, just left sitting on the desk as a reminder of what went wrong. Brit wasn't cruel on her own. I want to be fair about that. But she grew up inside our mother's favoritism, the way you grow up inside a warm house. You don't question it. You just live in it. She got the shopping trips, the long conversations over coffee, the way Diane's whole face changed when Brit walked into a room. I got the sighs, the once-overs, the way Diane would look at me at family dinners and then look away like she'd seen something that mildly disappointed her. Every single time, for years. What I did with all of that was become quiet, not shy. Quiet by strategy. I figured out early that the less space I took up, the less ammunition I gave her. I got good grades without being asked. I didn't bring friends home. I didn't ask for things. I became so low maintenance that I basically made myself invisible. And for a long time I mistook that invisibility for peace. I told myself I was fine. I told myself it didn't touch me. But you can only tell yourself a lie for so long before your body starts keeping the real score. And mine kept it in tight shoulders, in a voice that always went small in rooms where my mother was present, in a habit of apologizing before I'd even done anything wrong. The one place I ever felt like myself was at Nana Cece's house. She lived 40 minutes away in Hillsborough, in this small yellow house with a garden she tended like it was her life's work. Because it was. Nana Cece never once looked at me the way my mother did. She looked at me like I was something worth studying, worth knowing. She'd sit me down at her kitchen table and ask me what I thought about things, not what I got on my tests, not how I looked, but what I actually thought. I used to count the days between visits, but somehow, the older I got, the more those visits shrank. Last-minute cancellations, schedule conflicts. Diane always had a reason, always delivered it casually, and I never connected the dots until it was far too late. I left for Portland at 22 with 2 suitcases and a graphic design job I'd fought hard to get on my own. Diane's goodbye was a once-over at the door and, well, maybe a fresh start will do something for you. I drove 4 hours north and I cried the entire way. Not because I'd miss her, but because I was 22 years old and I was grieving a mother I had never actually had. I built a life in Portland, a quiet, careful, competently built life. And I kept my distance from Beaverton the way you keep distance from something that burned you. Respectfully, permanently, and with both eyes open. I thought I had processed it. I thought I had filed it away. I had no idea that a phone call was coming that would pull every single thing back to the surface. The call came on a Tuesday morning in October. I was at my desk, halfway through a client project, coffee going cold beside my keyboard. It was Brit, not my mother, Brit. Which told me something before she even spoke, because Diane always made her own calls, always controlled her own narrative. The fact that she'd sent Brit meant she either couldn't hold her voice steady or she was already managing something. Brit said, "Nana Cece passed this morning, Reva, peacefully, in her sleep." I sat very still. I said, "Okay." I said I'd book a flight. I hung up and I didn't cry right away. I just sat there looking at my cold coffee and feeling something hollow open up in the center of my chest that I knew no amount of time was ever going to completely fill back in. The flight home felt surreal in the way that grief always makes ordinary things feel surreal. The recycled air, the small bag of pretzels, the woman next to me watching a comedy on her phone. All of it felt like it was happening in a different dimension than the one I was sitting in. I kept thinking about Nana Sussie's kitchen table, about the way she said my name, fully, carefully, like it meant something. By the time I landed in Portland and drove the rental car toward Beaverton, I had this fragile hope that maybe grief would create a temporary truce, that maybe losing Nana Cece would make Diane softer, more human, more present. I should have known better. I had 26 years of evidence that told me exactly who my mother was. But grief makes you hope for things you know better than to hope for. Diane was already performing by the time I walked into the funeral home. That is the only word for it, performing. She was dressed in a perfectly tailored black dress, pearls at her throat, dabbing her eyes at precisely the right moments with a folded handkerchief like she'd rehearsed it. People kept coming up to her, touching her arm, telling her what a devoted daughter she'd been. I stood near the back and watched her receive every condolence like an award, and something cold and uncomfortable moved through me that I didn't have a name for yet. Britt was beside her, also dressed beautifully, also perfectly positioned. I was in a black blazer I'd pulled from the back of my Portland closet, and when Diane finally saw me, she looked me up and down once and said, "You couldn't have found something better than that?" At our grandmother's funeral. That was her greeting. I found a seat near the side aisle, and I stayed there, mostly. I spoke to aunts and cousins I hadn't seen in years, accepted their hugs, answered their polite questions about Portland, and through all of it I kept half my attention on Diane, the way you keep half your attention on weather that might turn. That's when I heard it. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I was standing near the doorway to the side corridor, and Diane and Britt were just around the corner, voices low but not low enough. Diane was saying, "The attorney's office is calling Thursday. I need you present, not Reva. You understand me. You stand next to me and you let me handle the talking." There was a pause. Then Britt said, "Okay, just okay, no question, no pushback." I pressed my back against the wall, and I breathed through my nose, and I thought, she's already working the will. Nana Cece isn't even in the ground yet. Later that evening, back at the family house, I quietly asked Britt when the will reading was scheduled. She glanced toward the kitchen where Diane was, then back at me, and said, "I think it's being handled privately. Mom said it's straightforward." I asked if I'd been notified by the attorney's office. Britt looked at the floor. That look told me everything. I went to the bathroom, locked the door, sat on the edge of the tub, and pulled up my email on my phone. Nothing from any attorney. I checked the junk folder, nothing. I had not been contacted. My own grandmother's estate, and I had not been contacted. My hands were steady, but my mind was doing something loud and fast that I couldn't quite slow down. The moment that nearly broke me came the next morning at breakfast. I was pouring coffee when Diane walked in, saw me, and said without even pausing, "Mama always felt sorry for you, Reva. Whatever she left you, if she left you anything, it came from pity. It wasn't love. I just think you should know that going in." She poured herself orange juice. She sat down. She picked up her phone like she'd just commented on the weather. I stood at that counter with the coffee pot in my hand, and I felt something move through me that was part devastation and part fury and part something else entirely. Something I hadn't felt before. A kind of clarity. Sharp and cold and completely new. Because something in me knew, in that exact moment, that she wasn't just being cruel. She was scared. And Diane was only ever scared when something was about to slip out of her control. She walked in during the second hour of the reception, and I felt the room shift before I even saw her face. It was the way people near the door went quiet first. That particular kind of quiet that happens when something unexpected enters a space and nobody knows quite how to respond to it. I turned around and saw a woman in her early 60s, silver hair pulled back simply, wearing a dark green dress that had nothing to do with performing grief and everything to do with actually feeling it. Her eyes were red, her chin was steady, and when she scanned the room and found my mother's face across it, something passed between them that had 11 years of silence packed inside it. I didn't know who she was, and then somehow, in the same breath, I did. Aunt Lorraine, my mother's sister, the one whose name was never spoken in our house without a particular tightening around Diane's jaw. Diane moved fast. I'll give her that. She crossed the room in under a minute, and I watched her take Lorraine by the elbow, not warmly, not in reunion, and say something close to her ear with that precise, quiet delivery she reserved for threats she didn't want witnessed. Lorraine didn't flinch. She looked at my mother the way you look at something you studied for a long time and finally stopped being afraid of. And she said, loud enough that the two nearest cousins turned their heads, "I'm not here for you, Diane. I'm here for Mama, and I'm here for Reva." My name in her mouth stopped me completely. This woman I had met maybe 4 times in my entire life had just walked into a room after 11 years and said my name like it was a reason. Diane tried to have her removed. She found the funeral home director, and I watched a hushed, tense conversation happen near the entrance. Diane's hand gestures controlled but sharp, the director looking deeply uncomfortable. Nothing came of it. Lorraine was family. There was nothing to be done. Diane came back to the center of the room and resumed her performance, but something had cracked in it. I could see it in the way she held her shoulders, higher, tighter, like she was bracing. I filed that away and went looking for Lorraine. I found her standing alone near the floral arrangements by Nana Cece's photograph, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the display table, looking at her mother's face with the kind of grief that doesn't need an audience. She saw me coming, and she turned fully toward me, and the first thing she said was, "You look like yourself. I mean that as the highest compliment." I didn't know what to do with that, so I just nodded. She reached into her bag, a simple canvas tote, the kind a person carries when they're not thinking about being seen, and she pulled out an envelope, old. The paper had that particular yellowed softness that means years, not months. She held it for a moment like she was making a final decision, and then she handed it to me. Inside was a photograph. I pulled it out carefully and I looked at it, and my brain genuinely did not process what I was seeing for several seconds. It was my mother, young, maybe 20, 21, and she was holding a baby. And she was looking at that baby with an expression I had never once in my life seen on Diane's face. Pure, unguarded love, completely open, like nothing in the world existed except what was in her arms. I looked up at Lorraine. She was watching me with careful eyes. I said, "Who is the baby?" Even as I asked it, some part of me already felt the answer coming like a change in air pressure before a storm. Lorraine said, "Her name was Casey. Your mother was 20 years old. She was alone. She was frightened, and your grandmother and I didn't find out until it was already done." Diane had given her up for adoption 3 weeks before she ever told either of us. She paused and let that land. Then she said, quietly, "Casey would have been 36 now. Just about your age, Reva. And you have her eyes. You have her exact eyes." The room didn't go silent. It was already noisy around us, but inside my own head, everything went completely, absolutely still. I stood there holding that photograph, and I felt something I can only describe as the ground reforming under my feet into a completely different shape. Every cruel word, every dismissive look, every ugly daughter delivered in that soft, precise, devastating tone. It was never about my face. It was never about me at all. I was a living reminder of the daughter my mother had abandoned, the guilt she had sealed shut and never once dealt with in 36 years. She hadn't hated me. She had hated what she couldn't undo, and I had been standing right there, every single day, with Casey's eyes, making it impossible for her to forget. That realization didn't make it hurt less. If anything, it made it hurt in an entirely new direction, because I hadn't deserved any of it, and I had spent my entire life quietly believing that maybe I had. I found my mother in the hallway outside the reception room, standing near a window with her phone in her hand, probably already texting the attorney. I had the photograph. I hadn't planned what I was going to say. I hadn't planned any of it. But my feet carried me toward her with a steadiness that surprised me, because my entire interior was anything but steady. She looked up when she heard me coming, and her eyes went immediately to the photograph in my hand, and something moved across her face so fast I almost missed it. Not guilt exactly. Something older and rawer than guilt. Something that looked almost like terror. And then, in under a second, it was gone, sealed back behind that smooth, controlled Diane expression like it had never existed at all. I held the photograph out toward her. I didn't say anything at first. I just held it there between us and let her look at it. She didn't look away, which surprised me. She looked at it for a long moment with an expression I couldn't fully read, and then she looked up at me and said, very quietly, "Where did you get that?" Not a question, a flat, dangerous statement dressed as one. I said, "Lorraine gave it to me. She made a small sound, barely a sound, more like a controlled exhale, and looked back toward the reception room, like she was calculating distances and exits. Then she straightened, squared her shoulders, and I watched her make the decision to come out swinging rather than crumble. She said, "Whatever Lorraine told you, she has her own reasons for digging up old pain. She was jealous of me our entire lives, and this is just the latest version of that." Her voice was steady, almost convincing. If I had been 22, I might have taken half a step back. But I was 33, and I was standing in a funeral home holding a photograph of a love my mother was capable of and had chosen to extend to everyone except me, and I was done taking steps back. I said, "Her name was Casey. She would have been 36, and I have her eyes." Something cracked across Diane's face then, fast and violent like a hairline fracture running through porcelain, and for one single second I saw it. I saw the grief she had been outrunning for 36 years, raw and enormous and completely unprocessed. And then the fracture sealed, and what replaced it was something colder than anything she had ever aimed at me before. She took one step closer, and she said, very low, very precise, "You were supposed to be easy to forget, too." Just like that. Like it was nothing. Like I was nothing. The hallway felt very small suddenly. I heard voices and soft music drifting from the reception room, and I remember thinking how strange it was that ordinary sounds were still happening while something was being said to me that I would carry in my body for the rest of my life. I didn't cry. I want to be clear about that. I did not cry. Something happened that was beyond crying. Something went very quiet and very permanent inside me, the way a door closes not in anger but in finality. I looked at my mother and I saw her completely clearly for the first and only time. Not as a mother who had failed me, but as a woman who had been failing herself for 36 years and had made me pay the interest on a debt I never owed. What neither of us had noticed was Britt. She had come looking for Diane and had stopped in the hallway entrance, close enough to hear everything, standing so still she was almost invisible. I saw her first. Her face was the color of someone who has just had the floor removed from under them. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just genuinely, quietly destroyed. She had grown up in my mother's favoritism without ever once being handed the receipt for what it cost. Now she was holding it. Diane turned and saw her, and for the first time all day, her composure slipped entirely. Not in grief, not in guilt, but in the particular panic of someone whose most carefully managed audience has just seen behind the curtain. She said, "Britt," and Britt held up one hand and shook her head and walked back into the reception room without a word. That small gesture, that one raised hand, did more damage to Diane's constructed world than anything I could have said. The will reading happened the following afternoon at the attorney's office in downtown Beaverton. I had not been informed, but Lorraine had, and Lorraine told me. I showed up. Diane saw me walk through that door, and her jaw tightened, but she said nothing because there was nothing she could say in front of the attorney. When the will was read, Nana Cece had left Britt a sum of money and a collection of jewelry she had always admired. She had left Diane the formal china and a letter I was not privy to, but that made my mother's face go white when she read it privately. And she had left me the house in Hillsborough, a savings account with 11 years of quietly accumulated deposits, and a handwritten letter of her own that began with the words, "My Reva, I always knew. I want you to know that I always knew, and I never stopped fighting for you in the ways I was able to." I read those words, and that was when I finally cried. Not from sadness, but from the particular overwhelming relief of learning that someone had seen you clearly all along, even when you were convinced you were invisible. Diane contested the will within 48 hours. I wasn't surprised. A woman who had spent 36 years controlling every narrative in her orbit was not going to quietly accept losing the one asset that represented her mother's final judgment. Her attorney filed on the grounds of undue influence, the claim being that Lorraine had manipulated Nana Cece in her final years into favoring me. It was a clean, calculated legal move, and for about 3 days I felt the anxiety of it sitting heavy in my chest every morning when I woke up. I had a house and a letter and a savings account, and now I had to fight to keep them. I sat in Nana Cece's kitchen those 3 days, drinking coffee at that old table, and I made myself stay steady. I had come too far inside myself in that hallway to lose my footing now, over a legal maneuver from a woman who had been trying to make me feel small since I was 7 years old. Lorraine made a phone call on the 4th day. She called me first, before she called anyone else. which told me everything about the kind of woman she was. She said, "Reva, I need to tell you something I should have told you before the will reading. About 8 months ago, your mother called me. We hadn't spoken in 11 years, but she called me out of nowhere, and I recorded it. Oregon is a one-party consent state. Everything she said is legal to use. I sat very still at that kitchen table, and I said, 'What did she say?' Lorraine was quiet for a moment, and then she said, 'She told me that she had been intercepting your grandmother's attempts to contact you for years, redirecting calls, deleting messages, telling Nana Cece that you were too busy and didn't want the relationship. She said it like she was confessing, but really she was warning me, telling me to stay out of it, or she'd find a way to make my life difficult too.' My coffee went completely cold while she talked, and I didn't notice until she was finished. The recording went to the attorney the next morning. I wasn't there when it was played. I didn't need to be. My attorney described Diane's reaction to me afterward in careful, professional language, but I could read between every line. The recording didn't just dismantle the undue influence claim. It demonstrated a sustained, deliberate pattern of isolation, of cutting me off from my own grandmother for years, of manipulating an elderly woman's access to her granddaughter. The contest was dismissed, completely. The house, the savings account, the letter, all of it remained mine, fully and legally and permanently. I got the call on a Thursday afternoon, standing in Nana Cece's garden, and I stood there among the late October rose bushes she had tended for 30 years, and I pressed my hand flat against the cold dirt, and I said thank you out loud to no one and everyone at the same time. The social unraveling happened quietly, the way the most permanent things often do. Lorraine didn't make announcements or post anything or call a family meeting. She simply stopped keeping Diane's secrets. She had been keeping them for decades, the adoption, the interceptions, the years of deliberate cruelty toward me. And she simply stopped. She told the truth when people asked. She told it calmly and without drama, which made it land harder than any dramatic revelation would have. Diane's carefully curated social circle, the church friends, the neighborhood women, the cousins who had always deferred to her, began to recalibrate. Invitations dried up. The phone got quieter. The woman who had built her entire identity around being seen a certain way found herself being seen accurately for the first time, and it cost her more than any court ruling ever could have. Britt called me on a Sunday evening about 2 weeks after the will contest was dismissed. I almost didn't answer, not from anger, but from a kind of exhausted self-protection that had become instinct. But I answered. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I didn't know about Casey. I didn't know about the phone calls to Nana Cece. I didn't know any of it, Reva." She paused. "I knew Mom treated you differently. I knew it, and I told myself it was just her personality, just how she was, and I didn't push on it because pushing on it would have cost me something, and I didn't want to pay that." It was the most honest thing my sister had ever said to me. It wasn't a full apology, and we both knew it, and neither of us pretended otherwise. But it was real. It was the first completely real thing that had ever passed between us as adults, and I held on to that, not as forgiveness yet, but as a beginning of something that might, with enough time and honesty, become one. I drove back to Portland on a Friday morning with Nana Cece's letter folded in my jacket pocket, close to my chest. I had arranged for the Hillsborough house to be properly cared for while I figured out next steps, whether to keep it, spend more time there, eventually make it something permanent. I didn't know yet, but it was mine. That kitchen table where I had learned what it felt like to be known was mine. The garden with the late October rose bushes was mine. And the ugly daughter, that label my mother had pressed into me at 7 years old in a grocery store checkout line, I left it in Beaverton, deliberately, consciously, like setting down something heavy you've been carrying so long you forgot it wasn't part of your body. I drove north, and I felt lighter with every mile. And for the first time in as long as I could remember, I didn't brace myself against anything at all. There is something uniquely disorienting about discovering that your parents' cruelty was never actually about you. You would think it would feel like relief, and eventually it does, but the first thing it feels like is a strange, complicated grief, because you spent years, maybe decades, quietly believing that if you could just be different enough, prettier enough, smaller enough, better enough, something would shift. You built entire coping strategies around a premise that was false from the beginning. And when that premise gets removed, you don't instantly feel free. You feel the weight of all that wasted energy, all those years of shrinking, all those mornings you looked in the mirror and heard your mother's voice instead of your own. That grief is real, and it deserves to be honored before you move past it. The hardest part of what I had to untangle wasn't forgiving my mother. I'm not there yet, and I may never be, and I have made peace with that. The hardest part was separating her damage from my identity. Because when someone delivers cruelty quietly and consistently across your entire childhood, it doesn't feel like abuse from the outside. It feels like information. It feels like truth. You internalize it the way you internalize your own name. And the work of healing is not one dramatic moment of realization, even though the realization matters. The work is the slow, unglamorous daily practice of catching yourself mid-shrink and choosing not to finish the motion. It is tedious and it is necessary, and nobody gives you a medal for it. What helped me most was not something I expected. It wasn't the journal I started, or the long walks, or even the therapy, though the therapy mattered enormously, and I want to say that clearly. If you are carrying something like this, please find a therapist who understands family trauma and narcissistic parenting specifically, because general talk therapy will only take you so far. What helped me most unexpectedly was Nana Cece's letter. Not the validation in it, though, that helped too. It was one specific line she wrote near the end. I watched you make yourself invisible, and I want you to know that invisible was never what you were. It was only ever what you were taught to believe. I read that line probably 40 times in the first week. I printed it and put it on my bathroom mirror. Not because I fully believed it yet, but because I needed to practice believing it until it became true in my body, not just in my head. If you are somewhere in this story, if you grew up as the scapegoat, the plain one, the difficult one, the one who never quite measured up no matter what you did, I want you to hear something that took me 33 years to understand. Your parents' inability to see you was not a verdict on your worth. It was a verdict on their unhealed wounds. Broken people do not distribute their damage fairly or logically. They aim it at whoever triggers their shame most directly, and if that happened to be you, it was because something in you reminded them of something in themselves they could not face. That is a terrible thing to have happen to you. It is not a reflection of your value. Those are two completely separate things, and the work of healing is learning to hold them separately, even when everything in you wants to collapse them back together. Moving forward does not require your parent to apologize. I know that is hard to hear because part of you, the part that is still 7 years old in a grocery store checkout line, is still waiting for it. But waiting for an apology from someone who has never once taken accountability is not hope. It is just a quieter form of the same suffering. What moving forward actually requires is a decision, a conscious, renewed, sometimes daily decision, to stop letting their unfinished story write the rest of yours. You are allowed to close that chapter without a clean ending. You are allowed to leave without resolution. You are allowed to build something whole from pieces that were handed to you broken. That is not settling. That is the bravest possible form of moving on. If you made it to the end of this story with me, I want you to know something. I see you. Not the version of you that learned to stay quiet to survive. Not the version that made herself small so someone else could feel big. The real version. The one who is still here, still trying to understand, still brave enough to sit with a story like this and feel every part of it instead of looking away. That version of you is not broken. That version of you is extraordinary, even if nobody in your house ever thought to tell you so. If any part of Reva's story felt familiar, if you recognized that particular kind of quiet cruelty, that precise delivery, that feeling of being the one who was never quite chosen, I want you to do one thing before you close this video. Just one. Leave a comment that says, I see you. Not for me, not for the algorithm, but for the next woman who scrolls down to the comments at 2 in the morning, feeling completely alone in her story, and needing to know that someone else lived something similar and came out the other side still standing. You might not know her name, you will never meet her, but those 2 words from you could be the thing that gets her through the night. That is not a small thing, that is everything. And if you are somewhere in the middle of it right now, still in the house, still in the dynamic, still trying to figure out whether what happened to you was real, or whether you are somehow making it too big, let me be the voice that tells you clearly. You are not making it too big. Quiet cruelty is still cruelty. Consistent dismissal is still damage. The fact that there were no visible bruises does not mean you walked away unhurt, and the fact that other people didn't see it does not mean it didn't happen. It happened. You know it happened. And you are allowed to take it seriously and get the support you deserve without waiting for anyone's permission or validation to do so. This channel exists because these stories deserve to be told. fully, honestly, without softening the edges to make anyone more comfortable. If this video reached you, it reached you for a reason. Subscribe if you want to stay. There are more stories here. More women who survived things that should not have happened to them. More quiet justice, more of that particular kind of ending where the truth finally comes out and the woman who was written off turns out to be the one who was worth knowing all along. You belong in that company. You always did. And to every woman who grew up being called the difficult one, the plain one, the too much one, the not enough one, I will leave you with this. Nana Cece was right. Invisible was never what you were. It was only ever what you were taught to believe. And you are allowed, starting right now, to stop believing it.